if the accusation is true or not, no one likes to be called a racist. We also don't like it when someone we love, respect, or publicly support is called a racist. We feel attacked and wounded, which then leads to a variety of possible responses of our own. Webster's Dictionary defined racism as a belief that race is the primary detriment of human traits and capacities, and that racial differences produce an inherent superiority of a particular race. So that means anytime someone believes something about someone else and that belief is based on that person's nationality, skin color, or anything else that one might use to identify race, that belief is one of racism. And anytime one person believes one race is holier, more worthy, or better than another race, that belief is one of racism. Those that live into the definition of racism don't have to be people who use racial slurs and display racist symbols. Racial slurs and symbols are just a way in which some people choose to express their beliefs of insecurity, inequality, and superiority. The thing about racism is humanity is not born with it. It comes from tradition. Tradition is defined as an inherited, established, or customary pattern of thought, action, or behavior, such as a religious practice or a social custom. And it is the handing down of information, beliefs, and customs by word of mouth or by example from one generation to another without written instruction. So if racism is taught, if it's a tradition, then it is something that can change, something we can relearn, grow past, and be healed from. In the second part of today's gospel, we hear a story of a confrontation between two races, a Canaanite and an Israelite. The Canaanites and the Israelites have a long history, a long, violent, and bloody past. The writer of the Gospel of Matthew wants us to remember this history, and I know this because the writer labels the woman as Canaanite. We don't personally think much about the name Canaanite. We see it throughout the Hebrew Scriptures, the land of Cana, the promised land of milk and honey. However, for Matthew's listeners, the name Canaanite had not been used for centuries. In Jesus' time, Gentiles from this area were known as Syrophoenicians. And in the same story in the Gospel of Mark, that writer labels today's Canaanite woman as Syrophoenician. The time frame comparison of these two labels would be if, say, we were telling a modern story about someone in Great Britain and we called them Anglo-Saxons. Matthew wants us to learn something from the power of his choice of words, his choice of names. The Canaanites were not only idol worshipers, they were labeled as enemies of God and enemies of God's people. When Matthew uses the label Canaanite, he wants us to remember the stories of how the Israelites invaded the land of Canaan, killing the native people as they went. And it's even recorded in the book of Judges that when Israel became strong, they pressed the Canaanites into forced labor. They made them slaves. The writer of Matthew wants us to remember the past so we can learn, grow, and be healed through this powerful encounter. They needed to be honest with the past in order to be healed in the present. This story, when we hear it, is always shocking to our system. And if it's not shocking, it should be. A woman calls out for help, and Jesus ignores her. She calls out so much that Jesus' disciples become uncomfortable and ask him to send her away. When Jesus does finally acknowledge and answer her, he says he was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. What she would have heard was that he was only sent to help her enemies, those who took her ancestral lands and pressed them into slavery. This woman begged for mercy, and she did something that most Israelites couldn't see past their own traditions to do so. She called Jesus Lord, Son of David. In calling Jesus Lord, Son of David, she showed him that she was not a lost sheep. She knew who he was, and she believed he could save the life of her child. Jesus' response to her cry for mercy was, "It is not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs." Because of her race, Jesus not only says to her she is not worthy, he dehumanizes her and calls her a dog. There is no honest way around it. Jesus just revealed his racism through the use of the nasty racial slur of calling this woman a dog. Throughout Jesus' whole life, he would have been taught that Hebrew people were the chosen people, and they were to remain pure and righteous. His racism was learned. It was a tradition. Do we hold this against Jesus? Or do we recognize that he did his best until he learned something new? And once he learned something new, he started doing better. Because today, Jesus learned something new and expanded God's box to include those he had been taught to exclude. What I love about this Canaanite Syrophoenician woman is that she forgave Jesus before she ever approached him. She forgave the people of Israel for their past atrocities. At least she forgave them enough that she was able to see Jesus for who he was and publicly confess it. She was also able to respond to his racial slur in a way that she became the teacher, opening his heart to a greater truth. Yes, Lord, yet even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall from their master's table. She is saying that the abundance of the master's table, the abundance of God, is so great that no one is unworthy of it. And even a crumb from that table restores life. Jesus had just said to the crowd, "Listen and understand. It is not what goes into the mouth that defiles a person, but it is what comes out of the mouth that defiles." We want Jesus to be perfect, but what had just come out of Jesus' mouth, if we're truthful, was sinful. In his humanity and through the luring power of traditions, Jesus defiled and degraded another human being. The good news is that the story did not end there. This woman healed the heart of Jesus, and once it was healed, once Jesus was changed, his only possible response was to heal the woman's daughter with the divine power of love. for the disciples and for the original listeners of the gospel, what Jesus said was not shocking at all. It was what any respectable member and leader of their tradition would say. But now Jesus' words did not reflect his heart, so he needed new words and new traditions. Jesus answered her, "Woman, great is your faith. Let it be done for you as you wish." And her daughter was healed instantly. Last week we heard Peter, in his desperation and surrender, cry out to Jesus, "Lord, save me." Today we heard a woman of Canaanite descent cry out to Jesus in desperation and surrender. She cried out twice. "Have mercy on me, Lord, Son of David." And she cried out, "Lord, help me." As we reflect on our own hearts and the words that come from our mouths, we will begin to notice self-righteous traditions that get in the way of our surrender to Jesus, roadblocks that keep us from fully living a baptized life worthy of the gospel. So, as we continue to learn, if what comes out of our mouths is not worthy of the gospel, may we humbly accept even the smallest of crumbs that fall from the Lord's table. Amen.